Hour, those of you who went, raise your hand if you had a good time. That was really amazing. Thanks so much to GTRI and to our other sponsors, LexisNexis and Authentify, for giving us our first subsidized happy hour. We will get started in just a minute. Kay is fetching people from the lobby. Welcome to those of you online. Next time, hopefully you'll be able to join us in person and you'll get to experience a happy hour. So, yesterday's sessions, I think, were very good. Thanks to everybody for participating in yesterday's sessions. I thought the taxonomy session went well. I thought the TIFTM session went well. Those were the only two that I attended. Excuse me, I have a bit of a cough. These allergies are still getting to me. They've followed me here from Austin. So what we're going to do this morning is we're going to have essentially a sales pitch. Each of the people sponsoring a Birds of a Feather session later in the day is going to have an opportunity to come up and describe to you why you absolutely must not miss their Birds of a Feather session. And on the basis of the quality of their sales pitch, you will make your decisions about where to be at 12:15. At 1:45 after lunch. I'm sorry, at 12:15 to 1:45 after lunch. So to start with, once again, thanks very much to our sponsors, the Georgia Tech Research Institute, LexisNexis, and Authentify. If you have not noticed it, Authentify has a podium out in the hall. They have some interesting technology to show you. If you have a few minutes free, it's worth your time to see these demos. I saw them a little while ago before we actually got to this meeting, and I think you'll be interested. So there is so the agenda for today is, first we're going to have a report from the TIFTM committee, which is the Committee on, of course, Trust Frameworks and Trust Marks. There is, and that's going to be in a sort of a presentation and Q&A panel format. We then have a talk from Don Tebow and David Rennie. We will have lunch, and after lunch we have committee breakout sessions. They run in parallel tracks. One of them will be 1:45 to 3:15, another will be 3:30 to 5:15, and then we will once again have a social gathering at a different venue, Marriott Suites Midtown, this time. And once again, I'm told buses will be leaving from here at 6 o'clock. So without further ado, we are going to go to the presentations about the Birds of a Feather sessions. And I'd like to invite first Naomi Lefkowitz to talk about the F6 session. Naomi. By the way, I forgot to ask Kay, I presume that each of these sessions has a web meeting or dial-in link provided on the agenda online. So those of you online, after watching these presentations, please look up the web meeting links for the session that you intend to attend.
Wait, I don't have any. Oh. I don't have slides. I thought this was just a pitch, right? To come to the F6 session. Is there a prize for who gets the most people?
Yeah, the most people is the prize for the people who get the most people.
So basically, I think Doug Lair gave a presentation about F6 the last plenary, and so I thought it would be good to have a Birds of a Feather to really discuss lessons learned to date. I mean, I'll certainly start with a little bit of level setting and update from the last time for those who might not be that cognizant of what F6 is, but mostly I wanted to focus it as a discussion about the kinds of lessons that we've learned in the three-party broker model. So, to both talk about some of the benefits and the challenges, particularly around privacy and business model and liability and sort of legal roles and responsibilities that we've been doing. Another big area of focus for us has been attributes and identity resolution. So we've learned a lot, and we're doing a lot of thinking about that, and would love to have a discussion and generate more, not just feedback for us, but I think it's pretty valuable for the steering group as a whole to be thinking about these issues, particularly around, what is needed and, what needs to be shared between CSPs and RPs or attribute providers and what doesn't. The other areas that we've been grappling with relate to the users, so user consent around the transaction, and also the user experience and perception. So we're about to commence usability testing, and would love to get thoughts and feedback, because particularly we're trying to understand whether it's going to be a significant perception gap in the federal space to be doing federation with commercial CSPs. So that's pretty much sort of the main issues that we would be talking about.
So Naomi, in case there's someone on the line.
Sure. The Federal Cloud Credential Exchange is a cloud-based broker solution that would enable federal agencies to consume commercial credential service providers, and without having to integrate separately with each provider. So, sure.
Okay, so that's the F6 session. That session is going to take place, let's see, where have I got that one? Which time is that one happening?
That's today.
Yes, but what time today is that happening? Okay, 12:45. Okay, so next up, thank you, Naomi, that's the F6 session. Next up, we have Adam Madlin to talk about a session on anonymity and pseudonymity and what those mean. Adam.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Adam Madlin. I lead the taxonomy work for the IDESG. I'm also the chair of the security committee. We've arranged a panel discussion around the important topics of anonymity and pseudonymity today. We have representatives from core committees, standards and use case, privacy, and taxonomy, who will be leading the conversation and getting into those topics. Our purpose is to start to discuss concepts of anonymity and pseudonymity so we can better understand them and determine how we have to apply them to achieve the vision of NSTIC. And so we're want to have a focused conversation to start that process. And we're hoping that we can develop some next steps on how we move this process forward. How this came about, which I think is a little bit relevant, is we, in the taxonomy ad hoc group, rushed head-on into the topics of anonymity, anonymous interactions, pseudonymous identities, and had a pretty deep set of conversations over an extended period of time on those topics. And as we were deliberating on all aspects of it, we realized that this is a much broader conversation, and we started to interact with privacy committee and with the use case efforts, and realized that there is a lot of related aspects of it that we've not discussed in a broader way across the plenary, across the IDESG, and wanted to facilitate a broader conversation. So we're going to start that process today. Bob has volunteered to facilitate the panel. I think he's going to have an interesting task of keeping everybody focused and in line to make it a constructive dialogue. So that's going to be today, and I look forward to everybody's contribution to that.
Thanks, Adam. I was going to do that pseudonymously with a bag over my head, but you gave my identity away. So those are the two sessions for this lunch that you have to choose between the F6 and the anonymity and pseudonymity sessions. We have two taking place tomorrow. These are going to be user experience and human trust experience and proofs of knowledge. So for user experience and human trust experience, this session was created in response to a request from Anne Rakuya Robbins, and I'll first ask whether Anne is on the phone and would like to describe it. If not, then Peter and I will give it a go. Anne, are you on the phone? And do we have a way to pipe her voice into the room?
She needs to call into the number, so I'll text her right now.
Okay. So tell you what, while we're waiting for Anne to call into the number, why don't I call Bob Thibodeau up to give the description of the Proofs of Knowledge session, which will take place tomorrow. Bob, and we'll have your line open in time for you to talk. Okay. Okay. But first, Bob.
Hey, tomorrow we're going to have a session on a piece of work that I've been doing for about 20 years having to do with proofs of knowledge. So it turns out if you look at the framework concepts out of IDESG and so forth and so on, there's a sort of a problem in terms of how the cuts are made. And the way to think about this is that the passwords, which are our sort of standard proofs of knowledge, are pretty bad. Okay, but if you look at identity providers and attribute providers, a proof of knowledge would sort of fit in a attribute provider, but it's really a part of what the identity providers do. So there's a need in the framework to sort of discuss, being able to provide a study area for proofs of knowledge. Okay, so there's some really interesting use cases. So I sit on the American Bar Association e-discovery and digital evidence committee, and we've been in the American Bar Association. We've been discussing proofs of knowledge for allowing people to log into websites. And so the concept is, I'll give you some use cases. So one use case is, in a living will, I can write in and I can say, if I have a stroke, test me for a proof of knowledge that you wouldn't normally test me for. And that becomes part of the living will if I want to log into my financial website. Or if I get over 75 years old, okay, test me for a proof of knowledge before you let me withdraw $100,000 for my caregiver. Okay. Or if I'm a kid, test me for a proof of knowledge that I passed the Piaget, level 3 11-year-old test. Okay. Or if I'm in college and I'm a parent, pass me, and I've let my kid have a $50,000 account, test me for a proof of knowledge that I'm not drunk. Okay. And so proofs of knowledge turn out to be, so it's more than just password, it's not just attribute. Okay. It's the brain. What the guy wants on the website is the brain. He wants to know that you're you, not just that you have your DNA, which can be replayed, but the right kinds of proofs of knowledge tests can tell you whether you're actually there when you're logging into the website and you can actually do something. So tomorrow we're going to have a birds of a feather session for anybody who wants to discuss proofs of knowledge as an interesting idea. We've taken this into the ABA. They find this really interesting. We're going to be at HIMSS in whatever that is, the end of February, doing an all-day session with the ABA on this kind of stuff. But the idea is to start researching this whole idea of what kinds of proofs of knowledge do we need to confirm to the website owner that this guy can actually move $1 million, okay? Or this kid can cash a check for $10,000, okay? Or he can say whatever he wants to say on a blog, okay? That's the idea for tomorrow.
I'm a little frightened. I thought I just heard the suggestion of a new banking regulation there. And by the way, the ghost of John Locke and his distinction between the physical and moral person continues to haunt every aspect of our proceedings here. I wish we had him here. He could probably clarify some things. So do we have Anne on the line?
Yeah, she's on the line.
Okay, so I'm going to, Anne, have you described what you're hoping to get out of this session? And then I think Peter also wanted to describe the other half of the session. So Anne, let's test if we can hear you.
Can you hear me all right?
You're coming through clear, but not terribly loud.
Okay.
Okay,
I'll
that's
try to
better.
speak.
Thank you.
Okay, good. Yes, I am presenting a Human Trust Experience Coordination Committee draft charter. It's tomorrow, Thursday at 12. At the last plenary, in the new business section, I brought up the issue that the human individual voice and perspective is really missing from this these proceedings and in general in the work so far. And without users, individual users, human users, trust, I think the venture will fail. And there are an extraordinary number of issues that offer new opportunities. Some people want to make this a fight between user experience work and human trust experience work. I don't think that it is or should be. I think this is different work and hasn't been articulated yet. From the individual's point of view, how do we establish trust? How do we hear it? What processes, procedures, relationships, information architecture, frameworks build that kind of confidence? And that really hasn't been articulated. I think this establishes new ground, and that it's important to be heard in a respectful way. And I'm very passionate about this work and would like to offer it to others to join in and have a really creative, innovative, and sensitive conversation about how we establish human trust. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne. And just to amplify for a moment what Anne said, so one of the tasks in establishing a committee in the IDESG, which we do rarely, is recruiting people to serve on the committee, because obviously we want to have committees that get work done and that have enough effort to sustain the activity. So one of the things that Anne is going to be asking at this session is for those of you who are interested to come and participate and to see whether or not she can demonstrate that there is a sufficient interest to form a committee that will have the capability to do ongoing business. So if you're interested in this topic, this is one of the tasks that the Management Council has set in order to decide whether or not to establish the committee. So if you're interested, it would be a good idea to go to the session and to indicate that you think this is something that should go forward, because otherwise it's less likely that the committee will be established. Peter, I think... yes, Anne.
Yeah, no, that's precisely where we're at here. I'm sorry that has come into this kind of interaction, but I specifically requested more time before this would come up to some kind of a vote, and it looks like you want to bring it to a vote and somehow kill it here, and I think that is, I just got cut off.
No, you didn't get cut off.
I think that's an example of there's something in this that you don't want to talk about, and I don't understand it. And to try to kill it at this time is a very bad omen for how the IDESG is going to reach out to individuals. And so there was no mention that we're going to have establish a certain number of interested people in order to proceed. I said I wanted to bring it to the plenary in April after I'd had much time to reach out and have deep conversations with people. And now I see that there was an apparent effort to head it off at the pass, so to speak. And I made mention yesterday in the Management Council meeting that this statement from Jim Zock, I was at that meeting, that he was going to bring the user experience committee and Darren Call and other people to the table to have this conversation, didn't take place. And I made an objection to the minutes. So I don't understand. This is not transparent.
To be clear, Anne, I didn't mean to imply that any action would be taken at this plenary to to dispose of the question of whether or not a committee would be created. In fact, the rules wouldn't allow us to take an action at this meeting because the charter has not, the plenary has not yet received a recommendation from the Management Council on the charter. So not only will we not take action at this meeting, it would not be in order for us to take action at this meeting. So I apologize if I gave that impression. What I was trying to direct the membership to do was go to the meeting and make up their minds for themselves about whether this is an activity that they would like to participate in, because eventually the charter will be brought before the body. So I'm sorry if I gave the impression that we're going to do anything at this meeting.
Yeah, not only that, but you have constructed it as a head-to-head with another committee that the charter was never passed, and I don't think that's the proper way for that to be discussed. I simply wanted to ask the question is, how is human trust established, and how can we make that viable and visible within the organization? And I presented some ways to do that.
Again, to be clear, I didn't mention in any other committee. All I told the membership was that they should go to this meeting and decide whether this committee is something they're interested in spending their time on. I have no opinion about the difference between this and any other committee, and I didn't bring any other committee into it.
But it states that on the invitation.
So I'll turn it over to Peter because he wants to, I think, address that.
Yeah, just to rewind a little bit, first of all, before we get sort of wrapped around the axle on this. When we, at our very first plenary kickoff in Chicago a year and a half ago, we were very clear about there being 4 priorities in terms of delivering the national strategy, one of which was the whole issue of making interactions online usable and for the experience for the user being very important. So this whole issue of user experience came to the fore right from the get-go, and at that time a committee pulled itself together, or tried to get itself together under the leadership of Darren Cole at the time, and as with every other committee that was set up by the plenary, and in accordance with the rules of association, each committee has to put its draft charter when it feels ready for it, and I appreciate what Anne's saying, that from her point of view, that isn't ready yet, and we totally respect that. The issue is that the User Experience Committee charter went before the Management Council. There were some questions and concerns which the committee took on and said that it's not right for prime time and for approval by plenary at this stage. So that committee itself never received endorsement by plenary to be established as a full standing committee of the plenary. Alongside that, and with concerns firstly about whether the User Experience Committee had got the momentum and the critical mass to move forward as a plenary committee, there were a number of other conversations of which Anne was started on a related but distinct subject, which she's described as human trust experience, and with a view towards trying to see if there was an interest in establishing such a committee. The only reason for putting these 2 issues together in a birds of a feather this week is, for me, the 2 objectives I'd be looking for, and I'm certainly looking for input and cooperation for Anne in helping with that, is first of all, are there 2 distinct pieces of work so distinct that they actually each merit a standing committee? Or is there one clear area of work which is more important than the other, which we can say, this is what we want to focus on? Whether it's the original ideas that came out of Darren Cole's committee or the stuff that's coming that Anne's articulating, that we think should be the focus of our attention going forward. So the objective tomorrow is really a brainstorming and a trying to assess is there a big difference between what's being said? Are we just using different terms for describing the same problematic, or are there distinct areas? I think there are parts of what Anna's shared with me which show that there are distinct areas from the user experience issues, and I think that the objective tomorrow is really just to try and articulate whether those can be formulated in such a way that there are distinct charters, or whether we do it as a single committee. So there's no sort of grand scheme to push people into having a vote this week. That's not the objective. It's really just to try and clarify those differences and see whether they are distinct enough to have two different work tracks. Thank you.
So would there be a decision tomorrow? Is that what you're saying?
There will be no decision tomorrow. There'll be a discussion tomorrow. So just to reiterate the process that IDESG uses to create committees, for those of you who may not have been here, when the organization began. The process is that a committee charter is created by an individual or a group who desires to initiate a committee. That charter is submitted to the Management Council. The Management Council reviews it, gives a set of feedback to the proposers, who may or may not revise the charter, and then the charter is formally proposed to the plenary at a regularly scheduled meeting for a vote. In order to do that, there has to be the usual requirements of notice for an item to be put on the agenda of the plenary for consideration, and we would ask for quorum and a variety of other things. But under any circumstances, the timing of the submission of any proposed charters to the plenary is under the control of the person or group who proposes the charter, and with the caveat that the usual reviews by Management Council need to be completed before the charter is submitted. So, and any action that would be taken would be taken only after you submit a formal notice to the plenary that you wish to have an action placed on the agenda of the plenary. So, so thanks to Anne and Peter. And with that, we have at this point, and by the way, those are the two sessions for tomorrow. So there's a user experience and human trust experience, birds of a feather discussion. There is a proofs of knowledge discussion. Those will happen during the lunch break tomorrow. And we have one more item today, which is not a birds of a feather session discussion. Instead, it's going to be a short presentation from Ken Clanstein and John Wandelt on the future of trust. So if we have Ken and John, if they would come up here, you will have a chance to be entertained for 15 minutes before you have to listen to me again. Okay. So my script confuses me. So this is a slick multimedia ad for a Birds of a Feather session, which will take place tomorrow. Thank you.
As he's setting up, I just want to make a comment that there.
Into the microphone.
Oh, okay. There will be a prize for the Birds of a Feather session that has the most people. It's just more red tickets.
Stand by, make sure we...
Man, this guy's tough.
You getting it, John? Unplugged. Is there audio with it? No.
No, there's no audio with the presentation, so. Live audio.
It's plugged in. I'm a Mac guy. Help me. Oh. Thank you. Sorry.
So I'm a Mac guy too.
Thanks.
Oh wait, no, I screwed that up. Yeah, right. And I.
There you go. So it's playing over here. You're good.
Okay. Oh. What do you think we have to click on, John?
I think you think if you click on this, you go.
Okay.
Okay. Want me to click for you? Or you want to click?
I got it.
Okay. It's like a comedy act here.
I love watching technologists operate technology.
Okay. For a while there, the future of trust was pretty dim, but I think we're moving it forward here. So just as context, both John and I have been long-term practitioners of federation and federated identity. John within NEF and the NEM context, and I within Common. And I think we share some concerns that having practiced this for a long time, the conversations seem to be a bit ethereal, and we wanted to get those fairly well anchored. And so the point of this presentation is to move from that ethereal sense of trust to some real deep substance and then take it along the path. It's important to note that the community, we both work within communities of interest. In common is research and education, and so we have Microsoft and other kinds of research players and also lots of universities. John's been working within the NEF Federation, which is law enforcement agencies, both local and national. And the community of interest is what defines what the trust needs are. And we've both had the experience that the trust framework wasn't developed full-blown from the head of Thor or Bob, but that it's been evolving, and we really wanted to get that concept into the space. Yeah.
So this is our infomercial. We're going to get into the detail and the actual birds of a feather. I think we've got about 10 minutes, and we've got a bunch of slides here, so we're going to kind of move through this pretty quick either. I got to know a lot of the projects and the people through interactions here. There's a lot of good work happening out there in the vendor community and trust frameworks and so forth. But what I've realized, that good work has to somehow all come together in an ecosystem. And one of the challenges I think that both Ken and I see is when you look at trust frameworks, they're so fundamental to making this all come together. But there's some challenges as you look at these trust frameworks. The scopes are very often very different. Some focus on identity providers, some focus on reliant parties or attribute providers. Some of these frameworks really aren't even called trust frameworks, they're federations, and they got their business needs hard-coded with their trust needs. It's hard to tease those out. So we're going to have a discussion about that. The differences in the scope, trust frameworks. We're really early in the maturity model here. Things are evolving, things are changing. So, you have people that try to onboard a trust framework or join some kind of federation, and things are changing below their feet. So we're penalizing sometimes these early adopters. So we want to have a conversation about that as well. And different groups and communities and stakeholders, even within the certain community, have different tolerances for risk. And so we need to think of how we adjust and work with all that. And we're thinking about this through a framework that's based on something called trust marks. And so our thoughts on moving forward, there's really 4 things we want to have a conversation about, is thinking about these trust frameworks as more as modular componentized. And we call those trust marks or trust elements or the periodic table of trust. But think of them as modular. We need to have a real conversation about a trust mark framework. What I mean real is deeper than PowerPoint, deeper than notional. If we're really going to have this working together on the wire, we've got to get real. So we're going to start that conversation. We've got to create a marketplace and figure out how to incentivize that marketplace based on trust marks. And then also we need to have the conversations about what is the real liability risk? Okay, and get real about that as well, and figure out different and alternative models on liability. And so we think those are the 4 things we need to start having a discussion about, working about, in order to move this from separate efforts into a more holistic ecosystem. We have a set of questions we want to explore at the birds of a feather. Of course, Ken has a lot of the answers, and he's going to tell you, he's going to just tease you on some of the answers here. As we get more involved, we'll address that in the birds of a feather.
So again, we want to distinguish trust marks and trust frameworks. And the trust mark is a selection of elements from the periodic table, and I'll jump out to that in just a second. And values, processes, and procedures assigned to those elements that focus on a specific thematic issue. I'll give you an example of 2 of our trust marks that we've been developing. One is on an accessibility mark, and one is the research and scholarship mark that we already have in deployment with some 70 applications vetted and approved for that. They're both marks. They're applying to different kinds of situations, and they may reference other trust marks, etc. John and I are going to have some interesting conversations on Friday about what is the metadata associated with the trust mark. I think we both feel, that, for example, that this is a small spud, but we need a logo. I'm not quite sure why John needs his logo. I need the logo so it can pass through into the privacy manager and begin to inform the user about the nature of the application that they're dealing with so they can make an informed decision about consent. So the logo is just one small piece. One of the other conversations in the metadata space may be, do we have to revoke marks? If so, how do we go about doing that? How do we audit that you're appropriate for the mark, et cetera? So deep space here. Marks probably don't evolve much over time. If you think about the marks that we use in the real world, they're pretty fixed. Certified fair trade, organic coffee, etc. They're fairly firm. Trust frameworks, on the other hand, are rapidly evolving over time, using the marks as kind of fixed points to build an evolving trust framework in that space.
Let me make one just comment on a trust mark. The most important property of a trust mark is they must be trusted, which means there needs to be disclosure, understandability. You need to know what that mark means. And you can be able to pick one up and say, I can trust this because I understand it. And that really comes through transparency and disclosure and a well-defined process that mark represents.
So, and John and I are both pilots in the NSTIC effort, and as part of our pilot, we have produced a periodic table of trust elements. I'll hop out to that in a second. And John's working with GTRI on a trust mark pilot process as well. So here's the periodic table, and probably it's, if I could step out to the PDF. On the laptop.
Oh, escape, okay. Okay, there you go. Yeah, you can.
Sorry for messing up here.
No, this is great. So the reason I'm hopping out to the PDF is so that I can hopefully expand some of this stuff, because this is an eye chart. It's an eye chart and a half. This is not all of the known elements in the world. One of the reasons we picked elements as a metaphor is because, and I hope this is enough people here who are old enough to remember the thrill when new elements were being discovered, Berkeleyum and all these other things. So we want to give you the thrill to note that there are still lots of elements to be discovered as we need them in our trust frameworks, and they will evolve over time. So let me see if I can blow up some of this stuff so I can begin to give you a flavor for this. I'm not going to spend, there is a website that begins to go through the explanations of this, but you can see that there's, the chart is scaled from issues that only concern federated operators down to issues that will concern users, etc. So when we get down to these bottom levels of the table, we're talking about impacts in the millions and billions of users. At the top of the table, we're talking about sets of issues that only concern federated operators. They're not going to become visible to end users in this process, etc. Some of this stuff is well developed because we've been living in the landscape for a long time. So signing key strength of members, we know way too much about that. And we have formal policies within our federation about how to work that. When you get down to the bottom pieces about T's and C's and other kinds of issues, we don't know much. We haven't structured the, for example, individual controls over privacy. We're developing a privacy manager to do that, but I want to, again, this is cutting edge thinking here, and we want to invite all of you to get involved in that. Let me go to one other, So again, the periodic table is out there. I'm not going to drill you through all that stuff. Wrong mouse. There we go. And then you can start to say, supposing I want to build an accessibility mark, what elements need to be addressed within the mark? So we've bolded a number of the elements. Okay. Full motion JPEG. Can you get me back to the slide deck?
I think you're over here.
So just to let you know that a mark is going to wind up invoking a number of different elements. The periodic table is a concept map. When we turn this over to John with the remaining 1 minute, he's going to be talking about moving from a concept map to specific parsable XML down the road as to give that substance. So I want to, our efforts are nicely coordinated at this point, but the point of the periodic table was just to illuminate the point of John's work in trust marks is to implement and execute.
So I think we got a couple more slides. So this is more than a tease. We need to go actually deeper. So We've done also some work beyond the periodic table to take a look at some of the trust frameworks to figure out what the trust mark should be. We're going to talk a lot about that during the Birds of a Feather, get much deeper in this. In the interest of time, we'll move through that. But also, what does a trust mark framework look like? What are the actors, the roles, responsibilities, the normative specifications, artifacts that are required for that? We'll talk a little bit about that as well. And then we'll also talk about how do you catalyze a marketplace to get this all going. And so how do you go from where we have the traditional trust mark providers, how do they map to this? A lot of what we're already doing, we just need to look at maybe a little bit different way to get this cross framework and cross COI interoperability. So we invite you to our Birds of a Feather. Of course, we think we are going to be the most interesting one.
Actually, I was going to go to a different one just because.
Okay. So we invite you to come there. We appreciate your support. And also, I would just make a comment, if you could take a look at the website we launched for Trustmarks, trustmark.teachri.gov.edu. Before that, that would be very helpful. Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys. I think the red tickets part makes it a little unfair. So to amend my earlier statement, there are 3 choices tomorrow: user experience and human trust experience, proofs of knowledge, and the future of trust. So at this point, we're going to switch gears. We're done with advertisements, and we're back to reporting on progress and work. So Andrew Hughes and Jack Seuss are going to present an update on the report of the TIFTM, Trust Frameworks and Trust Marks Committee. This is the committee which is dealing with issues like those that you just saw on the screen in the presentation here. They've been doing a lot of work lately. They have a draft document and some interesting results to brief you on. And this work in the form of documents in their final state will eventually come before you for adoption as IDESG deliverables. So, it would be a good idea if you hate something to probably object at this point in the process rather than much later. So it would be good to pay attention. With that, I will turn it over to Jack and Andrew, and I will go get another cup of coffee and come back and moderate a Q&A.
I'm going to stand on the other side of the stage.
Pardon?
I'm going to stand on the side.
Okay. Well, thank you. And Ken and John, hopefully you'll be able to also come to the 3:30 session that we're having today, where we talk about the paper that Andrew has started. I think a lot of the material that you have is going to resonate with where we are thinking about with the paper, but we could certainly use the benefit of all of your experience as we go forward in this. So what we're going to do today is Andrew and I are going to give you a brief update on the trust framework, Trustmark. I'm going to spend probably 20 minutes just giving you a little bit of an overview, and then Andrew is going to dive deep for probably most likely taking an hour to go through where we are on the interim paper that we have. It's a very, very rough draft. We do have a session today at 3:30 where we're going to be talking more about the paper. So as you have questions, as you have concerns, ideas, pluses, please come at 3:30 and share all of them with us at that point. So let's see. Down there, okay. Oh, right there, okay. Pressing the arrow. I could have done that. There. That's it. Okay. Thank you. Oh, okay. So here's what we're going to cover today. Just real briefly, generalized approach, what we're doing in the work plan, then Andrew's going to go through a much deeper dive of all of the items that are on the paper. So giving sort of the high-level general approach that we're trying to do in the Trust Framework, Trustmark Committee. This is a committee that, as some background, really was not, let me go back one second. That's interesting. Yeah, okay. It was not heavily engaged up until probably May or June. It started about for a few months, but it just never completely got off the ground. There were 2 separate committees for a long time. Andrew and I have been working with this committee since around the end of May of last year. We've had very active meetings. We probably have on average about 20 people at each committee meeting that we're having. We've been meeting weekly. Okay, that's you, not me. So the committee is focusing on a set of activities. I wanted to sort of bring up the NSTIC guiding principles, just as a refresher for everyone. Not that we don't all have these indelibly etched in our mind, but one of the challenges that we've had as we've started thinking about this is really, what do these principles mean in reality? It's one thing to say that something is privacy enhancing and voluntary, but what does that actually mean in reality when, as John and Ken are saying, when you're dealing at the technical level of a trust framework provider or a trust service? What does secure and resilient mean? What does cost effective and easy to use? Interoperability is a real question. And so the committee has really been looking at a lot of these items from a wide perspective. I highlighted the executive summary, the vision that is out there about individuals and organization utilizing secure, efficient, easy to use identity solution to access online services that promote confidence, privacy, choice, and innovation. How do we get here is really a question that the TFTM committee has been grappling with. And so I sort of highlight that, you can see I was not a graphic artist. But really the challenge is we've got today, we've got this cloud, we've got different activities that are going on, but at some point we've got this vision that's out there, and what we have to be figuring out is how are we going to evolve and meet that vision? There's some constraints that we have as we start to look at this. One of the things that we have to sort of recognize is that today the world is not satisfactory to most consumers. I don't know about you, but I always laugh when I look at what my wife manages for our home. She brings out a sheet of 50 different accounts, all with different usernames and passwords for managing a variety of services, from our financial transactions to consumer and other online activities that she does. This is going on all over the country, maybe all over the world, and it's certainly not the best way to be doing things. The elements, as I laid out before, the vision, they're easy to say, but they're hard to define. And so we really need to also understand that even once we define those items, that definition is going to change. As practice starts to happen, what we define as secure today is not going to be secure 2 years from now. And so whatever we set up, it cannot be so brittle that it can't evolve over time. The other part that is really driving the TIFTM committee right now is that there's a sense of urgency to try to demonstrate that we're going to actually deliver things. I put 2016 in there, not that that would be when the interim comes out, but the reality is if we don't have a pretty well working ID ecosystem by 2016, there's a change of administration. We all know that a change of administration, there's a wide variety of things that can begin to be dropped. And so I see it critical that we have enough of the ID ecosystem really out there as a reality that this continues on. And then lastly, just for the IDESG itself, if we're to remain viable, we've got to have a product. We've got to have a value proposition that we can be going to people. It's great to have plenaries. It's great to meet. But at the end of the day, we have to be moving towards things. And so that's bringing up this question of how do we come up with an interim model that can start to evolve and converge towards the vision. I think we have, besides constraints, we have opportunities. And I just list a few that are right here. We've got a lot of prior work that's been done in this space. We're not starting from a complete greenfield. Cantera, idmanagement.gov, what is often running the FICAM, the Georgia Tech activities, OIX, Safe Biopharma, In Common. All of these groups have done lots of work to date. It's not all the same work, and so we have a benefit of being able to look at these in a lot of different contexts to understand what is working and what would need to be changed to ultimately meet this vision that we're starting to see. And that's, I think, a real opportunity for us, that we don't have to invent everything from scratch. So the question that's there is how do we create a pathway to convergence? How do you take what's in there today, these various trust frameworks, as well as the NSTIC pilots that are sitting there, and say, how do we bring this together and then start to evolve it towards this vision that we're going to have over time? And what would that mean if we're launching that today? And so I'd like to first sort of step back a second. And no presentation is good in academic university if you don't have a math problem for people there, right? So, all going back to your calculus sequences that are there. The first one, the sum of 1 to n of 1 over n. Anyone know what the answer to that is? Infinity. It doesn't converge. It just continues to go on. The second problem, the sum of 1 over n squared from 1 to infinity. Anyone know the answer? Pardon? It's 2, that it goes to it. Yeah, it converges, yeah, right. So, the point that's here is little details matter as you're starting to think about whether an effort that you're developing is going to converge to a solution or not. And so one of the real challenges that we have as we're starting to think about this is, can we set up a process that we can have an interim model, and then we have a process in place and an evolution that gets us to the convergence of the vision that's going to be there? I don't know that we're there yet. That Andrew's going to list and give a description of his interim model. I think we have a lot of talking as a committee, as a plenary, as a set of groups to do to see if we can get to convergence. But it's really key that we have those conversations, because if we don't, we could end up in a path that's not going to lead us where we want. So the approach that we're using, I just got a few more slides before we jump to Andrew's, is the key thing about TIFTM right now is we're trying to be a good committee. And so what does that mean? We're trying to be transparent. Everything that we're doing, Andrew does a fabulous job of immediately getting it up on the wiki. If you want to find out the state of TIFTM, you can go out to the wiki and you can see all of the work products that we're working on, all of the minutes, all of the activity that's taking place. Everything is there on the wiki. We're really trying hard to be collaborative. Early on, it was looked at and viewed by some that TIFTM was going to come in and just immediately stamp what was going to be done, and that was going to potentially limit what other committees could be doing. We are going out of our way to try to engage with other committees, and I think we've had great relations with a lot of the different committees in terms of conversation and participation. There are some of the activities, in fact, that we think probably shouldn't be centered in TIFTM, that maybe they're more likely to be centered in one of the other committees, and that's a conversation that we want to have over the next month or so to see if there are activities that should be shifted from TIFTM to other committees to be taking the lead on. We're trying to be as open as we can in terms of making progress on these activities and sharing this. And the last thing that we're really focused on is the goal of delivering a consensus interim model sometime in the spring. We feel it's absolutely essential to start to have practice, that until you begin setting up an interim ID ecosystem, and you can then learn from that, and if we design it correctly, it should hopefully converge towards that vision that we all want to get to. So how are we going to get there? Right now, what we've done is we've set up a whole range of work products, and we had some committee breakouts on some of those. Tuesday morning, Joe Grubbs spent an hour and a half talking about his work in what we call TIFTM 0104, which is really looking at gaps, requirements of the ecosystem today. This is leveraging his pilot that he worked on a year ago and what the analysis that they had done. We had a talk yesterday afternoon where Dave Temashok began talking about work that they're doing, looking at trust listing programs, what some of the legal requirements would be, what are the vocabulary that we need to use. This is under TIFTM 0106. We have a survey that we're getting ready to go out that we want to share with the other committees before we send it out. But what we're trying to do is identify who could be part of the ecosystem. Are there other trust frameworks that haven't been engaged in ID ecosystem, and maybe they have relevant information that they want to share? I know firsthand from what I've done with InCommon that there are at least 30 international federations that are out there, and some of them are extremely well-versed and leading edge. Ken had listed the Surf Connects from the Netherlands. We should be reaching out and learning as much as we can from the international community about all of these activities. And so that's part of the goal of the survey that's happening. And then lastly, we have a committee that we really haven't engaged as much yet, but it'll be coming out of the paper around the roadmap or process for moving from the current state to the future state. What do we have to set up as a governance model within the IDESG to be able to be bringing these trust frameworks and processes in to support the interim model? We have a whole set of what we're calling work streams that are underway. You can go out to the wiki page and you can begin looking at all of those work streams. And if you go out, here's the deliverables that we have. You can then click on any one of the items that are in the lower level down there, TFTM 0100 or 02, et cetera. These will then bring up additional information as to what's happening, the status of it, any deliverables, work items. We really encourage people to begin doing that. I highlighted, we've got a draft survey that we've worked up that we're going to be reaching out to relying parties. We want to reach out to trust framework providers. We're really trying to understand who is interested in being a part of the discussion, what work they've done to date, what models, what standards they're using to be moving forward as they set up their environment. And we think that this is all going to inform as we move forward. Lastly, just where we are, all of the ones with asterisks are underway. And at this point, this is the last slide before I turn to Andrew to come up. We hold our meetings every Wednesday, 1 p.m. Generally, we've been going anywhere from 60 to 90 minutes. We ask people to hold 1 to 3 p.m. because occasionally we'll break it up and we'll have two of the work groups. One will go at 1 will go at 2 o'clock, but historically we've been dealing with 60 to 90 minutes for most of our meetings. It's a fairly active schedule because it meets every week, but we really encourage people who want to be engaged in this process. This is a great time to engage in the TIFTM committee. The next 3 months is really going to be where a lot of discussion goes forward, and so we encourage participation. And now let me turn it to Andrew to talk about the interim paper.
Thanks, Jack. That was a good overview. Bob, could you be ready to take questions or comments from the crowd? Just want to point out that the material that I'm going to go through here is very draft. It's a starting point. The structure of the discussions at Plenary today will be an overview right now of the material. Then at 3:30 this afternoon, we have a breakout session where we can dive into more detail. So consider the 3:30 session as a big parking lot. If you don't have questions and concerns about this material, I haven't done my job. So please write down the questions, frame them up, think about it a bit. Then at 3:30 we can have a deeper discussion. So, here we go. What I'm going to walk through is some of the elements of this approach paper, and it's really part of the planning approach for TFTM. It's an IDESG-centric work planning exercise, so keep that in mind. This isn't a view of the world. This is a view of the world from the IDESG point of view, because we have things to do. Okay? A very simple approach. First, figure out what our destination is. Come up with a common understanding of what our destination is. Figure out what this ID ecosystem looks like, behaves like, that sort of thing. Secondly, build up a scaffold. So the infrastructure of the discussions, the artifacts and things needed to build out the ID ecosystem framework. Then work on the rules and symbols. So what are the sample contracts, the criteria and processes needed to implement trust frameworks and trust marks in the ecosystem. Okay, so as Jack mentioned, we started to become really active in this committee in the May-June timeframe. And this slide tries to encapsulate some of the observations that I made when I started to look at the work at hand, some of the conversations going on in the group and in the plenary at large. What it boils down to is we felt that there was a lack of a document or description that we could all take a look at, examine, turn over, look at the rough parts, the smooth parts, what's been done before, and really debate about. Right? There's a lot of ideas in the room, a lot of concepts in the room. Every individual has their concept of what this ecosystem, identity ecosystem is. Does it exist already? Will it exist in the future? What's the shape and nature of it? But it wasn't coalesced into a reasonably tight, narrow document focused on the end state. As you see in one of the bullets, if we have a fuzzy expression of where we're going to try to get to, we have a problem with defining an approach because we have to do trade-offs, we have to choose what to do first, what to defer, and if we don't know where we're going in consensus, we'll never be able to decide on the appropriate approach. So this is just set up for the walk through the content. So as Bob has overpromised, the paper is not yet published on any website for you to look at. Thank you, Bob.
No worries.
It's a very, very rough draft of notes and comments. I'll post it this week. I just have some more input to incorporate into it as we go forward. Whenever I write a document that tries to take multiple points of view, I try to set out design parameters so that I don't forget why I'm writing the document. So these are some of the design parameters that went into my thinking and the questions that I've been posing to the groups about what kind of approach we need to look for an ID ecosystem. So the first two bullets should be obvious. We have to embody the end-state principles, the mandate, and we have to draw on the experience of the crowd. We're all the experts. We're all practitioners. So let's use that to come together and figure out what the picture's going to look like. We need decision tools and prioritization tools, ways to choose the flight path that will get us probably to where we think we're going. There's mention of an interim state. We can have an endless debate on what is interim. Is it the ecosystem that's interim or IDESG that is interim? Let's not answer that question just now. But we have to be able to pick a path forward that makes sense to us, to the membership, and to people that we want to engage for the ecosystem itself. So very quickly, document structure for this deliverable is simply here. It starts off with a description of the concept of an ID ecosystem. So trying to reflect back what I've heard. It's not everything I've heard, but it's hopefully a synthesis of the prevalent input that I'm getting from the TFTM group in particular. There's a couple placeholders that I've thrown in some sketches. We know we're going to have governance, governance structures, governance tools, decision matrices, decision tools, that sort of thing. I'm not going to fill in that section. I'm hoping one of the other deliverables that we have underway will help address that. And the introduction of this thing I'm tentatively calling the value matrix. It's a scaffold to figure out where we need to make decisions. So what are the decisions we need to make? What goes into those decisions? And how do we as a group of 50 in the TFTM committee and hundreds in the plenary, how do we come together and actually make a choice rather than have a discussion forever? So hopefully this is a a first step towards some sort of way to decide. Last bullet is quite an important one, and you'll see this in the later deck. By making choices up front on what we're going to do and how we're going to get there, we need to be able to examine the consequences. They're not all obvious. Some of them are, some of them aren't, but it will feed back into the decision process as we go forward. Okay. So, ID ecosystem concept. I'm going to remind you, this is an opinion. It's intended to provoke discussion. If you don't walk away with an opinion about the content, then your email is more interesting than this discussion. There's a lot of unfinished business in this, in the concept and in the decision tools. So think about what's missing, what you would need to see in this material, and bring it back to the committee, talk about it at 3:30 this afternoon. So this is a stake in the ground. This is something to push against. Right? I've tried to make it modular, using that term, but try to define it in pieces so that we can talk about the different pieces, test them, try to check with each other that it describes what the destinations that we think we're going for, and starting to come to a common concept vocabulary. It goes beyond the words. It's what are we thinking when we say the words. So, concepts and assertions. There's a few of these. I'm taking a slightly alternative point of view here, trying to put the model on its head, just to highlight some interesting elements that I think we need to talk about when we're looking at the trust frameworks and ecosystem. What I'm trying to do is put the interaction between the relying party or online service provider and their client in the focus. Right? What this means is that the trust infrastructure, so the trust frameworks, IDPs, credentials, all of that infrastructure exists to support, in part, that interaction between the RP and the client. The trust infrastructure is not at the center. That's what I'm asserting. We exist, and in the vision and the strategy documents, at that level, on the outwards publication phase, it's very clear. The point is to make online transactions easier, more seamless, interoperable, that sort of stuff. When we get into rooms like this, we tend to talk about the credentialing and the authentication and the authorization and the proofing. And sometimes we forget that it's actually the transaction between RP and client that is the purpose for the trust infrastructure. Okay, another assertion is that I'll say RP and online service provider interchangeably. So the RP sets some conditions which have to be fulfilled before the client gets their stuff. Could be, must possess a credential, must possess a token, must pay, must agree to terms, that sort of thing. And note, of course, today's interaction is mostly take it or leave it. In a picture, which will be adjusted as we discuss the ideas behind it. So within the box, we have an online community governance entity, analogous to the trust framework provider in the trust framework language. We have an online service provider. Sorry, this is backwards from that. So online service supplier and an online service client, so RP and their customer client. There's some sort of interaction or transaction that's going on. The RP sets some conditions which are fulfilled by the client, and then service flows. The online trust provider and infrastructure below it is used, for example, in authentication, to either set or fulfill those conditions. So, trying to come up with a simple idea for a complex concept. And I'm going to ask Bob's question before he asks it. That's your question, right, Bob?
Well, actually, it was more of an accusation than a question, but yeah.
Okay. one of the discussions we might have at 3:30 is why those arrows are single-sided rather than double-sided. Why is there no negotiation between the client and the provider? That's a good question, but the arrows are single direction, and that's the way it's going to be.
Yeah, just so the other question that one might ask is the RP free to set any conditions he wishes, or are there regulations on the RP's reasonable conditions? So there's all kinds of questions that could surround this.
And in the overall concepts, that particular question is deflected by saying that the online community's rules constrain what the RP can set as conditions. And the client gets to choose which communities they belong to, which providers they sign up with. It's a bit of a false representation of reality today, but it might happen in future. So, think of other questions, please, for discussion.
So, by the way, by that, Andrew, do you mean that people should feel free to raise their hands from now on if they've got a question, or would you prefer that they be held till the end?
If it's a burning question that you need to ask now, then please ask. Just raise your hand. We've got some microphones that can walk around. If it's going to take a deeper discussion, please either raise it, we'll write it down and park it for this afternoon, or just bring it to this afternoon session. Okay, so concepts and assertions, slide 2. In the N6 strategy document, we have these things called online communities. And I always try to put them in quotes because nobody here knows what an online community is. It's kind of an undefined term. But there are descriptions about what it is and what it does, how it behaves in various documents. Basically, an online community sets their own rules, conventions, standards. You might see these as a trust framework, rules of the road, practice statements, that sort of thing. It's self-governed, it's autonomous, it has participants and members, it has ways to join, ways to leave, might have audit, might have conformance if needed, but it's up to the community to decide what they need. If we take that line of thinking into a ecosystem-like world, you might see a community of communities. And that's the core concept of this description. So independent, autonomous communities that are interoperable inside of themselves. They follow rules, which are identifiable and documented. And there is some interaction between communities today. The lines between communities might start to blur as the overall space matures. As time passes, as entities like IDESG start to define or surface the common practices, common conditions and rules, basically as the industry matures. But community of communities is a basic premise of this structure. And I need you to challenge that. Because community of communities, while it's easy to explain how this might fit, it has serious shortcomings. But I am unable to describe alternatives in a way that is compelling, that challenges status quo, right? That's where you all come in. Okay? So we hear about different models, the trust marks model, the periodic table of trust elements. Those are other ways of thinking about how do we describe the interactions between the parties and how they trust each other in the end. So here's some advantages. So this is just the why is it a good thing? Infinite variation. So any community can be anything they define themselves, right? If we think about IDESG having a role in governance over communities, there's probably some basic rules they've got to follow, like your rules have to be written down, right? Something like that, as a very, very simple example. Communities, for the most part, can be independent, or they can be reliant on each other. And it could be a technique to bootstrap this NSTIC ID ecosystem, or IDESG ID ecosystem, that is branded in some way as NSTIC compliant, aligned, however that ends up being. Because we can take existing federations, existing trust frameworks and providers, and make them a community within the brand. So that's some of the advantages of it. As I said, I haven't put down the disadvantages. There are many. Scale also being one of them. So more assertions. Community rules or trust frameworks have to be aligned with or conform to IDESG rules and requirements. The reason I say that is because if we go along the path of having accreditation program, certification program, and a trustmark licensing program, as described in the strategy document, there's got to be rules. There's got to be a way to be acknowledged as part of, and if you haven't gone through the processes to be part of, by definition, you're not in the brand, right? It's a consequence of the current description and strategy, okay? I need you to test for yourself if this is an adequate description of what you need to see the ecosystem be or become. Okay? So remember, these are ideas which are intended to be pushed up against and tested with your own experience and what you see coming down the road. Okay? Following from this idea of community of communities and having a mark, a trust mark that is a license is granted to certified or accredited parties, organizations. These are some of the possible roles you might see as a consequence of that for IDESG. First of all, it's a rule maker, right? But we might say it's a pattern generator. It might set requirements rather than rules. It might set practice statements, best practices instead of explicit contracts, that sort of thing. If you're going to have a license for a trust mark, somebody's got to license it, so it'd be the licensor. Along with the first bullet, the IDESG could define intra and inter-community interaction methods. So what are the trustable, in big air quotes, transaction protocols, basic requirements for authentication, that sort of thing? Where can communities find this stuff? One of the possible roles is through the IDESG publications and concepts. A guarantor or backer of the mark. So I don't know if this one's true, but if you license a mark, people are going to infer that it has, if people trust it, they're going to infer that they can rely on it for something. There was a very brief discussion yesterday in one of the groups about reliance on products of the IDESG. This is trying to get at that a little bit. Do we own liability by issuing marks, or can we transfer that or assign it to other parties? Okay. IDESG, foremost, is the trusted brand. So those are some possible roles. There's more. Some of these are inappropriate. Some are poorly defined, to be elaborated, but that's the work, isn't it? So questions about communities of communities. The list is endless, but the scale problem. So what if you want to be part of many communities? How many marks do you need? How many marks should there be? What is a mark, of course, is implied in that. And why does this look like an extension of what we do today in the FICAM and Common and other federation worlds? How else could we or should we be doing this? Right. For example, it's been pointed out that the FICAM model is not universally implemented yet in every case where you have a externalized authentication. What are the reasons for that? Are there ways we can improve on the model, do it a different way to increase the likelihood of adoption? Okay, so that's the identity ecosystem concept. In the paper, it goes through it in a better stepwise way, I think. Tells the narrative layer by layer a bit better. So on to the next section of the document. This thing I'm calling the value matrix. So actually, could I get some feedback from the crowd first? Because I'm not used to reading a crowd like this. Did that first part make sense? Does it seem sensible? Yes?
So raise your hand if you followed the first part and you think it makes sense.
Good, so it doesn't just make sense.
Wait, hold on. You always have to ask the other question.
No.
Raise your hand if it... How many of you think it didn't make sense? Okay, we have 2, 3. How many of you didn't understand it? At least one. So a pretty good percentage performance.
On average, okay.
So Laura, are you raising your hand because there's a question in the chat room?
Yes. I have two questions, and so I'll read them one at a time. First comment is from Michael Duffy, and he says, or he asks, is it a correct assumption that the community of communities could have various foundation architectures, such as SAML, OpenID, Connect, OAuth, etc.?
Probably yes. Within constraints that we might see from, like if they're using insecure protocols, perhaps not. Jack?
Yeah, in fact, that was really one of the things that we were thinking about is going to need to be the interoperability question within communities is how do we begin to bridge all of the various technologies that are there.
And Laura, a second question from the phone, and then I think Naomi also has a question.
Second question is from Christopher Spottiswood, and he asks, Andrew, is this concept of trust between parties necessarily a transitive relationship?
TBD. You may have noticed that the reason it's widely understandable is that it's very high level. The details are to be worked out, but that is the work of the IDESG in part. So the deeper definitions will come. This is the frame for discussing.
So I suspect, for those of you in the room, that Chris Spottiswood asks this question because it has come up before in his experience, and transitive trust doesn't always work out that well. Naomi, did you have a question?
Yeah, I do. So what's the thinking on how this is viewed from the user's standpoint? And I mean, the individual, because I can see that the community, from a legal standpoint is very attractive, right? So when you're just talking about companies and companies dealing with the rules. But I mean, the trick with, the ecosystem that the hardest thing has always been the user's movement from one community to another. And certainly on sort of protocol level, that can be managed, invisibly, and that's what we're doing a lot with F6. But at the policy level, users don't want to have to manage different privacy policies, right? When they cross from one border to another.
Yeah.
So.
I have no answer particularly, but in the value matrix and the approach method, there's mechanisms in there to set priorities of what we address and how we address it early rather than late. So that can be moved into the appropriate order of discussion. One of the challenges with trust framework models and community-to-community models is where do you put the burden of proof? So who has to attest to what to be able to do whatever they want to do? Do we make the user carry a keychain? Do we make the relying party join every community there is, wherever the users are? Those are all decisions that have to be made. Yeah, but that's, it's in the user experience is foremost.
So I was just going to add that I would say that the original vision of one account is a difficult one because there are very different regulatory and legal requirements around how you do things in different contexts. Healthcare, financial, education, all have different rules and regulations that are overseeing activities that are going to be there, and saying that one account is going to necessarily work well initially for all of those, I think is a real daunting challenge for us to try to get to. The other side of that, though, is if we got to the point where we were saying every relying party could be their own community, that would be a bad thing as well, because we haven't really changed anything. We've just changed the vocabulary that would be there. And so I think that at the end of the day, the value back to the consumers should be around trying to reduce the number of accounts they have to have And in reducing those accounts, if we can also improve security, potentially through second factor, that would be wonderful. And then the last piece is beginning to have some common privacy, elements that may be there, I think could be a huge win for consumers as well. And so to me, there are some opportunities to have benefits for the end users, but that's a big part of the discussion over the next 3 months, is really to be figuring out what they are and how to then instantiate them and what the trust framework should be.
And before we proceed further, I should note that I have a request from our support staff that if you are in the room and ask a question, it would be good if you would stand when you ask the question so that the camera can show to the remote audience who is asking the question. And we do have a question right in the center to make things as hard as possible for our mic runner.
And sorry, a reminder that we have 30 minutes left, and I've got more slides to get to. 3:30, we can have extended discussions, so go ahead. Jim?
Thanks, Jim Fenton. I guess one question I've got about this is the different nature of trust between identity providers and attribute providers. I think actually some of what Jack was referring to might be addressed by having a number of different sort of communities of attribute providers that are in different subject areas, healthcare or education or whatever. But I'm wondering sort of how this, are you thinking of trust communities that would be specific to security that might be broader, and some that are more specific to different classes of attributes, or have you gotten down to that level of detail?
Haven't gotten to that level yet. And like I said, there's more elements in the document itself rather than the PowerPoint level. So there's more assumptions and assertions in the document that can be tested.
Please stand before you ask your question.
So trying to bring this to ground. So I'm the guy who raised my hand and said I didn't understand a word you said. So for me, it needs to be sort of something concrete. And the most recent big concrete thing we've had that's been destructive of IDESG's goals, right, is Target. And so that's a consumer problem, right? Consumers are now carrying cash to Target, right? And so the question is how does IDESG within this framework, okay, deal with a Target situation so that if I go to Target or Target.com or whatever, so they said, for example, that if you log into Target and buy stuff off the website, you're safe. Are you kidding?
Yeah.
Okay.
So in the idea of the value matrix and setting priorities, we have the chance to address specific needs of communities, consumers, and situations. Personally, I view that as a priority setting activity. If that's something that the brand of IDESG needs to address early to gain the confidence of consumers as a type of user, then we would move it up the priority level.
So
it's within the security point that you were making earlier, which is trust marks that talk about security might be interesting because they can give people confidence that what's happening in the back is actually been checked. And right now we have no confidence.
Yep, absolutely. Okay.
We have a question, one from Peter in the back. We'll probably better take his question or else he'll vote your stuff down. If you could stand, Peter, so that they can see you on camera.
Oh dear. Two brief comments. I think they need to be elaborated probably much more in detail later. The first one was a concern about the whole phrase identity ecosystem, and we've had this discussion bilaterally, and that is the way you develop the concept here is good, but there is a danger that people will say, well, it exists already, what's the problem? You're trying to invent something which already exists. And I think we need to be very clear that what we're trying to do is partly descriptive, trying to own that space of explaining what an identity system is about and recognizing that there are already trust frameworks and bodies that are working within that ecosystem, distinct from the target state of that ecosystem that we would like to see, which fulfills the INSTIC mission and is in line with the goals that and principles we're talking about. So it's a matter of steering an already existing ecosystem. Because I think if there's a sense, if people get a sense that somehow INSTIC is trying to, or IDESG is trying to invent a new ecosystem, there's a lot of people going to run away. Yep. The second point is around the word trust, and it's actually, I'm going to do something very dangerous now and disagree with Ken Klingelstein. When he was talking earlier about trust being something that users need to really know the details of in order to gain confidence. I think if you look at something like, in the credit card space, I have no idea as a consumer what the details of the retail agreement are that bind me in a transaction when I use a credit card. I just trust it because there's a reputation around it. And I think the challenge for us when we're talking about trust and trust marks, and again, that's something to be debated further, is how you make the balance between having the assurance behind the scenes that all the pieces are in place, the agreements, the laws, the protocols, the standards, and so on, but keeping it from the consumer's point of view as simple as possible so that when they see the mark, that they don't have to be looking at pages and pages of stuff to see whether they can trust it, but that there is an inherent sense that this is trustworthy and worthy of their trust.
One of the ways I express my sense of trust in transactional sense is, first of all, did bad things happen to me? Yes, I trust it less. No, I'm okay with it. And my friends, the social circle. Also, when bad things happen, how quickly was it fixed and acknowledged that it needed to be fixed?
So I'm going to ask you one question and then let you get on. And the question goes back to your diagram, which we need not go back to, and it concerns the nature of a transaction. So we often think of transactions as, things that assume that an account has already been set up and, that a credential has already been distributed. Does your conception of transactions within the framework include the sort of non-commercial transactions, such as applying for a new account and setting up an account and all those things?
It's intended to, yes. I realize that using the word transaction is not a good idea on that slide, so I'm trying to find a better word. And interaction was about as good as good as we could come up with.
Words are tough. So one more question from Daza in the back, and then we'll go to the next slide. Daza, don't forget to stand up and smile for the camera.
Thank you. Daza Greenwood, bang,
That
starting with a
Daza
bang,
falling down.
from MIT. I was going to say, I had a similar view as Peter when I was looking at this, but what I was gleaning was that this paper seemed to be a description of the current state that maybe I wouldn't describe as a current ecosystem. I know these are things that haven't been discussed, and there's no consensus across IDESG yet, but when I saw it, it struck me that today's state is a state of systems. We have identity systems today, but they don't yet cohere into what you might call an ecosystem in the sense it's used in NSTIC, and it has, in that sense, a coherent set of boundaries, and there's some self-correction, there's some balancing. The ecosystem itself hangs together in a coherent way. Today we have a number of different identity systems for sure. And as I looked at the paper and the idea that it was this interim and the design considerations in particular and the way it was structured, it seemed like you were trying to map how do we get from our systems to an ecosystem in an iterative way. I guess I wanted to say that it strikes me that the questions being asked here maybe should be honed as particular items to be surfaced and discussed in TIFTM and the other committees and the board of directors so that we can start to find consensus over, do we think we have an ecosystem of identity today? Yes or no? Are we trying to create an ecosystem, or are we trying to facilitate an ecosystem? So I guess in closing, I guess I'd say, I hope that, I personally don't necessarily think the particular things that you've put forward in the paper are necessarily right or wrong. Some are probably right, some are wrong. But I really like how you've put together a framework in the paper of a value matrix and of a way that we can now think into and find those areas of consensus. So I found it to be an entirely fruitful endeavor. And I guess I would like to hear your thoughts about how best we could ingest what you've got and where you think the real decision points are versus the things you're putting forward as things that you think we might want to accept. Thank you.
That's on slide 342.
Now we're going to give you a little Hunger Games head start and not ask questions for a little while, and we'll come back to questions at the end.
Yeah. So Daza, good points. I circulated the documents about a dozen people to try to get some early feedback. That's why some people are talking about it as if they read something. They actually have, but it will be published more widely. And one of the points of having the concept on paper or electrons is that we can actually see some of the implications and talk about them as if it was a real thing already. Right? So that's kind of one of the major points of it. Okay, value matrix, and I'll try to talk faster. Design considerations, again, I like doing design considerations, and I hope you've been reading while I've been fielding questions. IDSG and TFTM need or want a way to do incremental evolutionary approach, work prioritization method, and I'll let you read the rest of it. Remember, this is from an IDSG TFTM point of view. We must get work done. So I'm looking at it from that point of view primarily and describing as much around it as I need to define the work and make choices about the work. That's why you see the tilting towards this very central work product point of view. Okay. And I'm done. Nice. No. The structure of the matrix. Standard grid matrix goes from low to high things, right? Each column, there we go. Each column is focused on a community or organization. There's any number we need of columns, okay? But the intent is to read it row-wise. Lower rows are less, higher rows are more. The left side is analogous to what we think of as trust frameworks and trust framework providers today. Okay? The right side is what I'm starting to call the value side. It's where we talk about, each column is what value can be derived or received by a community or its members by being at that row. So we'll see that in a couple more slides. But basically, the idea is that let's say the community decided it needed to be at row 3, whatever the actual terms of row 3 are. It can establish a column of value or values for itself that says, as a member of this community at row 3, you, a participant, can expect these benefits, expect these protections, expect these activities to be happening. It's a consequence of getting a trust mark, being accredited, approved. Right? And we'll see that in more detail as we go through, and of course in the paper. So just think matrix, low to high, trust framework, value proposition. The communities define their own value propositions for the most part. Okay. So I'm actually going through the matrix from left to right, column-wise, with the next set of slides. Okay. Now, I will point out that the names of the columns and the actual content of the columns is to be debated and to be built by the group. Okay. I put in some examples of what I think you might want to see in the columns themselves, but it's not right. It doesn't quite hang together just yet, but that's the discussion. Okay. So, far left column, publications. And these are the outputs of IDSG committees. We might go from low to high, a simple membership agreement to join the IDSG Inc. guidance for doing trusted things online, requirements for doing trusted things online, criteria, accreditation programs. You can see the kinds of things that might go into a publication stack. Next column, a measurement process. An increasing range of conformance process rules. So the requirements of a conformance process tested against the publications. A series of marks. This should be contentious, but if you go along with the premise that it's low to high with publications and processes, you might see the first row as being the ability to declare that you're an IDESG member. Then you might be able to get a mark that says your online community is aligned, then approved, then tested and certified. Right? So it's a trust framework-oriented language. Okay? And these are just hypothetical inventions. Okay? So that's the left side. Just that. So trust framework-like things on the left side. And I know I'm not explaining this in any particularly understandable way, but we can talk about that. The right side. So the consequence of having achieved whatever the left side prescribes or specifies is a series of benefits and value propositions. Right? It's intended to be a communication tool. So a community can tell its participants and other communities the benefits that that particular community will realize from participating at that row level. Sets expectations. The community should probably, with assistance, define their own value propositions for those rows. Okay. So that's the structure of the matrix. Bob, is there anything else that I really need to explain about this before?
So it's clear to me, but I read the paper. I think maybe you should ask the audience whether there's anything else.
Yeah. I realize I didn't actually describe it very well, but between shortness of time and the fact that we have further discussions today, bear with me.
I was just going to add, you know, as we brought this paper in to the group, I wouldn't be shocked if 60% of the paper changes. You know, I literally, as Andrew sent it to me, you know, I was ripping through it and saying I disagree with this, or I would change this, or I would look at this in that way. This really is draft 0.1. You know, and what we're really coming to the community to be saying is, as you start looking at the paper, it's easier for you to react to something that's on paper. I don't understand this. I don't like this. I like that. Than it is to be trying to sit down and pull out of people what it is that they're expecting to happen. And so this process is really one where you need to engage in this, but tell us what you like, don't like, and that feedback is really going to be critical.
So I think, Andrew, why don't we try and finish the slides, and then we'll ask for questions at the end.
Okay, so if you remember from way in the beginning, 300 slides ago, the presentation is the idea of a concept of ID ecosystem, the value matrix, which is a tool for decision making, and now approach, which is how do we use the decision-making tool to set priorities. Okay? And what I've described in this is a couple of patterns and a way of using the tool. The question is, how does a value matrix equate to an approach for actual work and planning? Well, we pick which cells to build out first, in what order, for what priorities and needs we need to have early or can defer. And the note basically indicates that this is all part of the larger body of work. The work of TFTM and the other committees will fill in many of the blank areas that have to go forward. Okay, so a hazy slide. So let's say, for example, IDESG decides through discussion, through testing, scenario testing, talking about the scenarios, that the number one priority is we need members to sign up to IDESG.inc, just as an example. What would that look like in terms of doing things in order? Well, I propose that it might look like you finish the easiest bar first for people to join up. You have membership agreements, the ROA, you have things that someone who signed up or a community that signed up can publicize about themselves, they're a member, they're in, but you complete the process of the entire row first. Then when you've got uptake for membership, if this is the way we can get members to sign up, you progress to the next row, set the bar higher, and keep going. Okay? So it's a way to say, and in the paper it's a little bit better, it's a way to say this is a primary objective of this group. Therefore, we should do this work first, this work second, this work third. And this is just a schematic of how that might look on the matrix. Just another simple scenario. If our highest priority, or one of our major priorities, is to influence the existing ID ecosystem towards better practices and alignment with the UNSTIC principles, what might that look like? Well, we have the value proposition and guidance through a publication at sort of moderate levels, right? Here are good things you need to do. Here's the value you will get from doing it. Then we work on the marks. We give the community the common practice we're receiving from the group, reflect it back to them. We say, follow along. There will be some sort of accreditation process that comes along, but this selection of choices is more about influencing rather than directing the existing ID ecosystem community. It allows organizations and communities to align to something. So it's a way of setting priorities. Each of these cells is a lot of work in this formulation. We don't have the bandwidth to do this. I'm hoping that some of the great work coming out of the pilots will fill in a lot of the blanks and a lot of the cells, but this is a decision-making approach. That's what it's intended to be. Yeah. I couldn't decide if I should leave this slide in or not. Interim, what is interim? Is interim a state of the ecosystem, or is it the state of IDESG itself? Debate as you will. It's some state between now and then being undefined. So I apologize for not being able to define interim. And that's it.
So I see that Jim has a question in the back here. The rest of you, there's also a question online, so we'll go to Jim first and then to Laura. And those of the rest of you who have questions, please raise your hand so that I can put you mentally in the queue.
And just as a time
Thank
check,
you,
we've got
Jim
about
Zock,
10 minutes.
I note your last comment, and I want to second your notion there, that it strikes me as you were talking and going through this, and after listening to Ken and John present what they are doing in that pilot, that at some point an overlay of those slides against one another would take a lot of fuzz out of this and perhaps come to a point of aha for something that can be a baseline to proceed from.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a quick meeting with John yesterday. It's like, really, you guys have done this? This is great. It fits in some way. Either this fits into that or that fits into this or some way, but yeah.
Laura, I believe we have a question from the online community.
Sure. I first had just a comment from David Moss, and that was referring to Daza, what Daza said earlier. And he says ecosystems are made by nature. We're talking about intelligent design here, an intelligent ID design, and not an ecosystem. He said use of the word, quote, ecosystem should be minimized when talking about ID. So that was a comment.
We're going to have to come up with something else for E.
The next question is from Anne Rakuya Robbins, and this is for Andrew. What do you mean by what cells? You said the first level decision is based on what cells?
Did you say that? I think that may have been an auditory thing. I think you may have been speaking of cells, CELLS, in the row.
As in Excel matrix cells,
okay.
Yeah.
Other questions from the room or online?
So clearly everyone understands exactly what we're doing here, right?
Well, so I'd actually like to follow up that a little bit. So the paper is a discussion draft, and it is intended to start two different discussions. One, a discussion about what the content of the interim ID ecosystem framework will be, and another about the methodology that we will use to do our work to move toward that content. So leaving aside for the moment the specific details of what Andrew has presented, I want to ask first whether, I want to ask you to sort of either discuss or sort of raise your hands about whether the structure of this discussion is, in your opinion, the right way to think about discussing the content, and whether it is the right way to think about discussing the process that we're going to use to get to the content. So I guess the right way to do this is to ask, does anybody have any serious concerns that this is structurally flawed as a guide to the discussions that we're going to have? Is anyone still awake and capable of raising a hand? Yeah, oh, I see. Yeah, so that's, yes. So, Kalia, I think you had a comment. If we can get the microphone over here.
Thanks for all your work, Andrew. It's difficult. It's admirable to listen and synthesize. And I think there is also an opportunity to consider options for listening to the wisdom amongst plenary members and beyond in a non-linear way. And we might consider parallel conversations that then also are synthesized as an additional modality of working for this body that may leverage the wisdom of all of the people who dedicate their time to come to these meetings and get talked at.
Yeah, Jay?
So I think you've hit on an important element. The reason we wanted to bring it up in the discussion today is this is too big of a conversation to remain in the TIFTM committee solely. And so what we're trying to do is start to get this going. I like your idea. Maybe we can come up with a way where we would do something where we do a public and you probably have better contacts than I do, where we could be talking about the next iteration of this document in a more public, and maybe it changes dramatically in a public setting where people bring back, again, additional prior work that says, you know, here's something where you should be thinking of, or a different approach. I'm sure as we talk to Ken and John after the Birds of a Feather tomorrow, this is going to veer, you know, some degree in a different direction. And so again, my goal on this is just trying to be moving this as expeditiously through some various drafts. I think what we're going to see at the end is going to look a lot different, and all ideas are open and on the table.
Yes, I hope it will look different by the time it's done.
So I guess, of course, it'll look different. The question is whether it will look, you know, sort of structurally different. And I guess when Kalia was talking, it kind of crystallized something that was in the back of my mind. Both the previous presentation and this one have a very sort of Cartesian square boxes in neat lines and columns aspect to them. And for some weird psychological reason, I sometimes resist Cartesian layouts. On the other hand, the discussion is clearly, it has so many pieces that it's going to have some structure, or else we just will talk past each other. So, you know, I think it will repay the audience, you know, attending this afternoon's session and pondering, you know, whether the picture is structurally right to guide us through the discussion in a good order. I'm not suggesting that it isn't, but I'm also not suggesting that it is. It's, you know, how the community chooses to think is sort of the issue. Are there other questions or comments for Andrew?
And Bob, the point about the attempt for neat and orderly in boxes, not circles, and fuzziness. I think this way. What you see up here is the product of how I address a problem like this. I hope that you will engage and explain other ways to deal with this problem in parts or in whole, because we each have our methods of thinking about stuff, and we're bound by that. So.
Yeah, and I mean, of course, at the end of the day, the objective is to achieve clarity, right?
Yeah.
And so we don't all necessarily have to be aesthetically pleased. We just have to be clear.
Yeah, of course.
So there is a concept here that seems to be completely missing, but is in all identity ecosystems that I know of. And these are, you can think of these as universals of every identity ecosystem. And so I'll give you just one example, okay? In every identity ecosystem that I know of, there's a distinction between a breeder credential and a use credential. It's everywhere, okay? And yet, there's nothing in any of y'all's documents. There's nothing in your framework that says these universals. There's like 6 or 8 of these universals out there, okay? And there's nothing that says, okay, these are universals that we observe in all the systems. And so this is something that's properly under our framework, because these are universals.
Help us put them in.
And yet there's no talk about this, there's no discussion. These are actual discussions that take place by people who studied all these systems, okay? And they look at them and they say, well, here's a universal, here's another universal, here's a universal. These things should be part of the framework, right?
Yep.
So the trust mark idea, and I don't mean to be contentious, the trust mark idea has nothing to do with universals, right? Do you have a breeder document? Who cares? Okay. How did you get to the point where you can issue the credential? That's something that's useful to know. Okay. So there's a whole bunch of areas here that y'all are just simply not addressing. Okay.
Absolutely.
That you would think would show up at the very top level of these things. That's the reason I don't understand a word you said. I'll see you.
Okay. And let's talk. That's exactly the kind of feedback we need to see and hear.
So we have time for one more question, and there is a question online from David Weitzel, I believe.
Yes, this is more of a comment than a question. David Weitzel says, trust, known versus knowable. It's okay to have a dashboard as long as you can lift the hood and understand the system and can diagnose what happened if something breaks.
So I gather that our speakers have no response to that other than it looks like acknowledgement. So at this point, Kay, is our break 15 minutes or 30? Okay. So at this point, we will have a 15-minute break. It's important to get back from this one on time because we have a remote presentation about UK identity scheme, and it'll be coming in, over the telephone. So let's respect our speakers' time and get back on time at 11:15. In the meantime, let's thank Andrew and Jack for the good work that they've presented here. And of course, I commend to your attention the session that will take place later today to discuss this in more detail.